This is Josh Harrod. Thank you for listening to Astonishing Legends. Let's get back to the show.
All right, a huge thank you to Dr. Chris Cogswell for joining us again. Thank you so much, Chris, for taking the time. Again, find his podcast, the Mad Scientist Podcast, anywhere you get podcasts. Also with his co-host, Marie Mayhew, who has her own show called Whatever Remains. We're huge fans and friends with both of them, so find those wherever you get your podcasts. So before we go to the next steps, we're getting into our conclusions and final theories here, and there's a lot of folks the people that are hate listening to us, we're just waiting to jump on us about ancient aliens, possibly. They might be. I don't know. Maybe they're not. And by the way, love you guys too. We love anybody that's listening. Thank you for listening. We've got to talk about the ancient aliens thing a little bit. I guess where I want to start is that, you know, history's mysteries, Giorgio Tsoukalos, who we do not know. We know lots of people that know him. Yeah. He's on the convention circuit, all that stuff. Seems like a wonderful guy, by the way, before you vilify him and for all the things he says and does. We don't know him personally. He did a cameo in something, such a good sport about himself. I can't remember what it was, but it was a cameo where he kind of made fun of himself. Which it's like, if you can do that, you're a good person. But in general, I wanted to see their take on this. So we watched the Ancient Aliens episode, which was on YouTube for free, about Pumapunku. And he went there, and there was a lot of analysis, and he talked to some very polarizing folks in the field of the ancient alien theory, which was to be expected. But a lot of his analysis archaeologically and from a scientific standpoint, there were a lot of good points that he made.
Right.
You know, he talks about the site. He talks about the faces that are found in the walls of the courtyard there. There's 175 of them that I think have been unearthed. That's not a number that means anything because there's probably a lot more that still are buried. He makes some observations that these faces, could they be alien? I was, no.
Well, some of them are weird looking, but it could be
some of them are weird,
stylized art. Yeah.
There's gargoyles are weird looking. There's a building in downtown Asheville, North Carolina with 1,000 crazy faces on it, which I think was the guy that built it was angry at people he borrowed money from or something. I can't remember. I've taken the tourism tour. But anyway, they're all designed to make fun of whoever he was involved in the construction of the building. Yeah. Anything could be going on when crazy faces are put on a building.
Right.
I don't think that's aliens. There's other ideas. It's like, is this a landing pad and all of that? And here's what my takeaway, with all due respect to Giorgio Tsoukalos, who I would love to meet someday. My takeaway was that when you look at this episode, there's a lot of really interesting ideas in it and archaeological ideas about its origins and what it means in the big picture of humanity and civilization. And then there's it's sprinkled with these suppositions or possible ideas about ancient aliens theory that seem a little bit out of left field, at least when applied to this particular topic. And I'm not categorically denying the idea that we could have been visited in the past. I don't know that that's the case, but I am saying that I'm not necessarily on board with the reason that this is such a magnificent site is because aliens came down and brought the knowledge and gave it to folks that were too primitive to do it themselves. I am not on board with that. And I am not necessarily on board, this is just me, with ancient aliens being involved with this site in any way. I don't think that's what's happening, but I do believe in the idea of sophisticated lost technology. I believe in what we talked about with Cogs, about the idea of maybe they figured out a way to use plants to break down and soften stone, turn it into a slurry that they could then transport in an easier way. Much like, and I talked about this, Heist, which was the Casa de Papel, the Spanish series on Netflix, where they, spoiler alert, boy, I probably shouldn't go here.
They robbed the place, actually? That's what happened.
They robbed. I don't want to do it. I don't want to spoil, but there's a similar idea to how do you move something monumental? You break it down. So there's a whole lot of philosophy behind this, and I don't think we got into it so much with Cogs as I wanted to, but one of the things that is uncovered in the research was the idea of the guano being the binder for this concrete from this era, and that they would have to go down to the coast and get the guano. It would come back on these llamas, and it was passing Manquigua, I believe it was. There was a trail that went through there, and they know that there was a lot of guano trade, and they were, as we said with Cogs, they were consuming more guano than they should have been. And of course, his point was like, well, you don't really know what that means, because he made a really great point, which I loved when he said it, and I was like, oh yeah. He was like, they had the raised mound agriculture, and they had their own fertilizer in the ditches with the plankton and the fish that they could recycle up onto there. So there's no reason they would have needed all that guano. But he's like, we don't know that they knew that. Yeah. They might have known that guano worked, so why not bring more guano? They might have brought 10 times the guano they needed because they knew a little guano worked. And that's a really good point. We don't know.
Here's the other point, though, that they seem to know now. Earlier, when we talked about the unearthing of the archaeological treasures at the bottom of Lake Titicaca near the island of the sun, Isla del Sol, and that Tiwanaku was a major trading spot. It had a lot of influence, and there was a lot of wealth being passed there. That's why, some of the stuff to a degree, like we said, when we talk about the elites, there's money and wealth involved and status, but it wasn't through military might as I think, it was about trade and spirituality. Yes. A lot of stuff was coming through. Like we talked about those shells, the spondylus shells, those are 1,200 mile away artifacts. And that means those are transported over a long distance as something very valuable. And there you go. If guano is that valuable, and it was, that place was Guano Central, the nest of the Peruvian booby. And yes, it's another name. I know this series is just rife with joke names, but that's the name of the bird. It's the name of the seabird.
So the Peruvian booby lives in proximity to Lake Titicaca.
Well, they're along the coast here.
It's a long way away. Yeah. Is this a blue-footed booby?
No. This is the Peruvian booby. The point here is that their nest is almost pure guano. So it's like sitting in a hardened ring of guano that you can mine, that you can farm.
Okay, right. Okay, so the Peruvian booby has a nest of pure guano, and it lives near Lake Titicaca. I just wish my son could be hearing this episode right now.
Well, that's why we don't have him in there, because we're trying to keep down the giggles, okay? Yeah. We're trying to be mature about this. But there's other birds too. The Guano cormorant is a huge producer of quality guano. Here's just a little something from the wiki entry on guano, okay? The word guano originates from the Andean indigenous language Quechua, which refers to any form of dung used as agricultural fertilizer. Archaeological evidence suggests the Andean people collected guano from small islands and points off the desert coast of Peru for use as a soil amendment for well over 1,500 years. That's in our time span, okay? And perhaps as long as 5,000 years. It's known about for a long time in its use. Spanish colonial documents suggest that the rulers of the Inca Empire greatly valued guano, restricted access to it, and punished any disturbance of the birds with death. The Guano cormorant is historically the most abundant and important producer of guano. Other important guano-producing species off the coast of Peru are the Peruvian pelican and the Peruvian booby. People have even gone to war over guano, the countries of Bolivia and Peru, because it's a precious resource. And whoever controls the resource, a lot of money involved.
Well, when you think about that value and the value being ascribed to it, it makes you wonder how far back the power of what they could do with it goes in their culture. Why does it have so much value? That may be something earned over generations and generations for all its various uses. And one of those uses may be masonry.
Yeah.
That's a possibility, right? I mean, we have to consider that.
Well, again, this is reading from the entry here. The Guano Age, there was an age of guano, ended with the War of the Pacific, 1879 to 1883, which saw the Chilean Marines invade coastal Bolivia to claim its guano and saltpeter resources, saltpeter being an element of gunpowder. Knowing that Bolivia and Peru had a mutual defense agreement, that's here's the actual facts on that, folks. Chile mounted a preemptive strike on Peru, resulting in its occupation of the Tarapacá, which included Peru's Guano Islands. And then with the Treaty of Anson in 1884, the War of the Pacific ended. Bolivia ceded its entire coastline to Chile, which also gained half of Peru's guano income from the 1880s and its Guano Islands. The conflict ended with Chilean control over most of the valuable nitrogen resources in the world. Chile's national treasury grew by 900% between 1879 and 1902, thanks to taxes coming from the newly acquired land. So there you go.
Well, and this is how wars, or why wars are fought, I should say.
Yeah.
So over guano.
This whole idea, though, where things become racist and problematic,
yes,
I believe is when you come out and say directly, well, these people aren't smart enough to have done this, so it had to be somebody else. But I also want to say this. I don't think that necessarily applies to all people who believe in the ancient astronaut idea or the concepts, because I think you have to say directly these people are inferior in your mind. You could say that these people were where they naturally were in their development, but something came in, an external force, and it could be other tribes. It could be other people like them, but another culture, which may have happened with the Tiwanaku and the Inca, or the Inca coming before, developing further, becoming more of a state than the Olmec. But the Olmec being younger, I guess, as far as their timeline goes, but more advanced in some ways, they influenced the older Inca.
So what you had was a pre-existing culture that was influenced by a culture that came along later, but had a more sophisticated civilization or ideas of civilization, or even if not more sophisticated, ideas that appealed to the pre-existing culture, which then adopted them and wound up outliving the culture that brought the new ideas forth. That's what's complicated about it, right?
These are people from the same continent, essentially, okay?
Yeah.
But what we're saying is that the great cities of the Inca really didn't happen until their contact and influence with the Olmec, even though that they rose up, you could say. I mean, people existed, of course, in the area, but what we're counting here is aspects of civilization and its influence in the area. And what we say specifically about the Tiwanaku is that it was very influential. But what we're not saying is that it had to be delivered from people on UFOs, or even something, as we see in the Ancient Aliens, making a nod to perhaps Zecharia Sitchin's idea of ancient Sumerians and the Anunnaki, and it's a whole kettle of corn there, kettle of worms. Some people have linked that to the development of some of the technologies down here. My thing is that, well, if they're ancient aliens, was the alien technology also ancient? Or, as I think I said in part one, could they have come down and just given them all iPhones? There's no reception, but like, here's a device, you can communicate with each other locally, and isn't it cool? It's holographic because we're aliens, and it doesn't matter that this is 1,500 years ago. We're still really advanced. Or were we just more primitive aliens? I don't know. That's what
I want to get back to one of my original points is I don't think aliens were involved in Tiwanaku or Pumapunku in any way.
Because here's what we see. This is what we have to go on.
I still am open to the ideas of aliens possibly having visited us. Because here's the thing, and this begs a whole other question, and we're already going off the deep end here, but like, if you refuse to believe that aliens have ever visited us from any reason, from anywhere, whether it's interstellar space or another dimension, or one of my favorite theories, they are already here, they just live under the ocean. They pop out when they need to check in on us or control us or whatever. Whatever the idea is, if you're open to any of those ideas that there's ever been visitation, then it's not right to say, well, it couldn't have happened thousands of years ago.
Yeah.
Because for a technology that sophisticated thousands of years ago is seconds, less than a second, a thousandth of a second.
And you're talking about these, for them to develop that fast, this could be a culture that's been developing for 100,000 years.
Right. So it doesn't make sense to say, oh, well, yeah, I believe in aliens, but I don't think they ever came back and interfered with anyone before me.
Right. Or they didn't exist until 1950. Yeah.
Right. That's another one of those vanity situations. But then there's probably people who are like, I don't believe in aliens at all. And not only that, they certainly didn't influence ancient cultures.
Right.
And that's okay too.
You and I read to you, I think you were doing something else. I read to you, we always look at Brian Dunning's articles to see if he's written something about one of the topics. And he had. Brian Dunning is one of our very old and dear friends that we've never met or communicated with. He may follow
and he might
me.
not call us.
No.
Yeah, we were caught up in some Twitter things, and he was like, unsubscribe, I think is the only thing he's ever said.
It may not have been about us. I think that was over the Jalowit
No, it was
doc.
other people.
Yeah, that was the Jalowit doc photo talking about Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan. And I think he was like, yeah, I'm out of here. But that goes to a point. I can't remember what he thought about the whole Amelia thing, but the Occam's razor, as Chris talked about here, in the touchstone, the lodestone for skeptical thought, a lot of the times people will say, is that it's Occam's razor, the most simple explanation. The simple explanation being they just were good at cutting stones. And it just took them a lot of time, as we said with Chris, time and pressure, generations.
Yeah.
Just they had some technology. Well, you wonder about that, though. It's like you have to leave some things. It's like, well, they must have had pretty good chisels and saws that we don't have any, evidence of now. So you're assuming that they just must have, because these other things like geopolymers, I think, and some other maybe stone softening. Like that seems a little far out. That's impossible. So what I would say in Brian Dunning's article here, now he has a podcast called Skeptoid.
Yes.
And a website for each of the episodes like we do. And it's SKEPTOIDC.
If you hate listening to us, you're going to love that show.
Well, it is,
but
it's
the
common
show.
sense. Yeah. Well-researched, very digestible, interesting reads. He's a good writer. And he has an article titled The Non-Mystery of Pumapunku. And just to sum up, you have to look everything through the filter of personal belief of the person coming through. Now, he doesn't believe in aliens at all. I don't believe that he believes in aliens or UFOs,
right?
At least as an explanation for anything. So that's where he's coming from. It's just pure what we know, right? Empirical, I guess, evidence of what we can determine just through our current senses and evidence. So he's coming at it like that. And, like I'll say one thing that he said is like, well, it's not Atlanteans, and he lumps that into non-human intervention with this technology at Pumapunku. But really, I think Atlanteans are human. They're just, that could be lumped into more lost human technology. They're not aliens. And they're certainly not all just white folks. There were different, as we covered in our Edgar Casey thing, that yes, there are Atlanteans, but some of those were people of color too. They had their variety then, but that technology and all that they did was lost. But as we said in part one, we're not talking about flat screen TVs here. We're talking about maybe crystals and crystal energy or whatever, however woo it is. It's just another development in a different way. I was going to bring this up. Remember Prometheus? I think they did a good job. The aliens there, it's like, well, those are humans, but their technology is a lot different. It developed in a different fashion, style, and method. And like, they don't have videotape like we do, but they have this gel that it has photon particles in it, and you can play the gel, and it plays back. And so throughout the ship, they can see the holograph playback of these other humans, these other large humans before, and what happened when the ship crashed and they got into trouble. And their technology looks different, but it's more advanced than ours. So it's an interesting concept to me. It's like, it doesn't look like the ship from Alien or Star Wars. It doesn't look like any of that. They tried to make it look different, as if their technology evolved on a different track with a different set of stylistics, or that's how it was developed. What I would say about Brian's point, though, is that he is saying, like, look, it's kind of a disservice, and it's illogical to say that this had to develop from some external source, and certainly aliens, because there's no evidence of that. We only can also go by what we've evidenced in our research, and there's nothing that fantastic that is way outside of the thinking. I believe it is advanced technology of a very earthy kind, involving plants, rocks that are there, metallurgy from smelting of local minerals from ores and things like that. Is that
things that were ahead of their time?
Yes, but not out of this world. That's what we found here. But left with that, I think there's two remaining interesting hypotheses on how they did what they did. Because again, you have to look back to, what does archaeology say? Archaeology says we don't know. We just don't know. We don't have enough information yet. It's going to take a lot of excavation. So right now, we just know what we see. Now, this is the amazing part of this, is that what they left behind, that in itself is amazing.
Yeah. When you look at the blocks, when you look at especially the andesite or the volcanic ones, and how smooth the surfaces are, and all the videos that we've seen on YouTube, we haven't had a chance to go there ourselves. We absolutely want to do that. But like, when you see these, you're looking at this footage of these blocks that it's straighter and flatter than glass and very polished. It's very clearly not something that was chiseled.
Right.
It's perfect. It's perfect surfaces.
Just to finish up Mr. Dunning's article here, his conclusion is, so once again, we have an accomplishment by ancient craftsmen who some paranormalists have attempted to discredit by attributing their work to aliens. This is not only irrational, it's a non sequitur conclusion to draw from the observations. Most people don't know how to intricately cut stones, because those are skills we haven't needed for a long time. We've had easier ways to make better structures for a long time. But this argument from ignorance, that just because we don't know how to do it, nobody else could have figured it out either, is an insufficient explanation. Simply say that you don't know, instead of invoking aliens. This is not only the truth, it accurately represents the findings of science so far. And perhaps, most importantly, it leaves the credit for this wonderful contribution to humanity where it belongs, with the Tiwanaku themselves. So I'm on board with that.
I'm on board with that too. Most of that. I don't think it's necessarily an insult to speculate that there's an outside influence. I think it's just part of the process of trying to figure out how it happened.
Right.
And if you're a super open-minded individual, you might be like, okay, well, let's look at this. Like, could this have been this way? Could this have been that way? What if aliens did it? What if it, like, I don't know that you're insulting people when you're saying that.
Right,
but I also agree with Mr. Dunning's assessment there and that final conclusion, and that's very interesting. But another thing I want to talk about here, and I know you have something else to say before we get to it, but I want to talk about this discussion that they had with one of the Aymara elders on ancient aliens, talking about what the local people, how they feel about their own culture, because God forbid we should actually talk to somebody who's living there.
Yeah.
To me, the more racist component is this all coming out and sitting from the outside and looking at it on the internet and making our conclusions and then saying that their cultural observations and what their elders think aren't important because they can't be assessed scientifically. That, to me, is the ultimate insult.
Well, it's an ironic racism in that becomes scientific hubris. Again, it's taking that Sherpa elder, and I think this must have been back in the 60s. Again, I love that story, but I can't remember the date. It was a while ago.
Yes.
Yeah, so they bring him, they bring the Sherpa elder to New York, and they take him to the Bronx Zoo, and he'd never been to America. I don't think he'd been to a zoo before, but the certain guy knows the animals from his area, right? And they're saying they take him by the bear cage, and they said, there you go, that's a Yeti, right? Right? That's what you mean when you say Yeti. He's like, no, that's a bear. I know what a bear looks like. That's a bear. Then they happen to walk by the gorilla cage. It's like, that right there, that's a Yeti. That's what a Yeti looks like. Not exactly, but it's more ape-like. Right. There's a lot of hubris. We've talked about this before from people saying, well, those myths of yours.
You don't know what you saw.
Yes, those are anthropologically, they're very interesting and they're very cherished, but you guys don't know what you're talking about scientifically. So
exactly. Just for folks that are new to the show, or if you're listening and you haven't heard our back catalog, back in December of 2017, we did a multi-part series on the Yeti, and we had Dr. Daniel Taylor on, who wrote an amazing book about the Yeti called Yeti, the Ecology of a Mystery. So if you're interested in that at all, go look for that in our archives. So one of the things that happens is all these scientists come in, and they come in from different cultures with different levels of education, and they get off the airplane and they go there and they stay there and they look at just the scientific assessment. And I get that. I get that that's important. And if Cogs was on with us now, he might be like, well, this, a part of that's the only thing that matters. But I disagree with that. I don't think it's the only thing that matters. I think the cultural components matter. What do the elders think? What do the stories say? If you can't put all that stuff into it, and if you're just disregarding it because it's not quantifiable or can't be specifically measured, then you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Those stories mean something. There's a kernel of truth there. That's where everything comes from. And to me, you should start with that stuff. And that's one of the things, on Ancient Aliens. For example, here's the perfect example of it. You say, oh, well, I'm not watching that. It's Giorgio Tsoukalos. He hosts that. Everything they say is stupid. That's dumb. That doesn't make any sense. Well, Giorgio Tsoukalos went and spoke to an elder in the community living at Tiwanaku now, today. Or not today, whenever that episode was that we watched about this. His name was Rene Quispe.
Yeah.
And they had a translator there, and he talked about their origin stories and all the stories that center around not only Tiwanaku, but Pumapunku and the Isla del Sol and Isla de la Luna and the idea of the origins of the Incas, but what happened before that. And they talked about a lot of things that were really fascinating. And one of the things that elder brought up was the idea of the Watchers. That's a whole nother thing. Maybe, Forrest, you can talk a little bit, not to put you on the spot, but just like if you were to tell our audience what the Watchers represent in
Well, this goes back to the Book of Enoch and Enochian magic and his I was thinking about this a little bit. I didn't want to go into it, but Enoch supposedly had advanced knowledge of agriculture and earth sciences, you could say. And that knowledge was buried. We talked about this way back in Oak Island. It was that a 9-chambered underground kind of thing where knowledge is stored. At the bottom is the golden delta with the name of God on it. That's part of this. To your earlier point about what do the elders think, that's also part of it. There's also an anthropological and a cultural aspect of all of our knowledge of this place, which should be considered. yeah, like you said, it's throwing the baby out with the bathwater because it doesn't fit into your puzzle here, or it's just not of interest to you. And I can understand that. But let's also find out what they think and what they're...
Yeah, let's find out what they think and how does that frame what we're uncovering now. And so, because when you look at the archaeologists that first came to the area, one of the first ones was Poznański. And Poznański came to a whole lot of conclusions that today are apparently widely disregarded.
Right.
Now, are they disregarded because it was the early days of archaeology, or are they disregarded because the approach now pays less attention to the cultural influences and the cultural knowledge that preceded the excavation?
I think there's a tendency to, is that you have early turn of the 20th century, Western European academics coming in who may have had a racist bent or lens to their viewing of what was going on and their interpretations. Just to finish, to get back to your point about the Watchers. So the idea, though, is that there were angels who were in charge of watching over the earth and early humans. They saw that the daughters of men were lovely, and they came down and mated with them and created the Nephilim, or the Nephilim, which were a race of really awful, giant, horrible beasts and people and hybrid. And Goliath of David and Goliath has been speculated to have been one of the Nephilim. And that you have these, now it created horrible beings that eventually had to be vanquished. And that ties into the Watcher lore, that there were, you could say, superhuman type beings near the lake. And that's part of their creation myth.
Yeah, and this is another thing I'd like to point out. If you're interested in giants and the Nephilim, we did a series called The Tall Ones, which you can find back in late January and February of 2018 that talks about this stuff. All of these things tie together, and what happens in what we used to say on the show more often than we say now is that everything is connected. And it's not fair to disregard certain components of those connections just because they're outside the wheelhouse of your specific milieu. And that's the thing that I like to see when we look at these stories and we look at the scientific application. I do think it's important to also take into account the archaeological, the anthropological, the sociological, and cultural application too, and take all of that together. And again, coming back to the Rene Quispe, who they spoke to on Ancient Aliens, he talks about the Watchers. He talks about Viracocha, which everyone in the area talks about, obviously, because Viracocha is a god who created the first two Incans. But they're saying that came up after the darkness, which we talked about this with Cogs just a few minutes ago. But they also talk about the Eaglemen, the court of Viracocha being Eaglemen, and Poznański, that early archaeologist who spent 40 years in the area. He didn't get off an airplane and come spend 4 or 5 years and go away and come back and all that in 20 years. The guy was there a long time, and he determined that on the Gateway of the Sun, that was actually a calendar. Yeah. And when he did the math on figuring that all out, he determined that calendar went back 24,000 years. Yeah. So now when you say that, and it's like, oh, I'm clicking stop on this podcast. It's like, no, but wait, let's entertain that possibility. Let's entertain all these possibilities. He was there a long time. So again, and Tsoukalos points that out, and he says, Poznański, today, a lot of people think, well, you know what, there's nothing wrong. He didn't know everything. Right, he didn't have the bigger picture. But the problem for me is that their idea of the bigger picture, in air quotes, is to disregard everything but what you can measure in a test tube. To me, that's the opposite of the big picture. The big picture takes it all into account, the spirituality, all of the possibilities. You don't have to embrace them all. You don't even have to believe in them all, but consider them all. Don't just write them off because they're outside of a tangible thing that you can write down on a logic table and make sense of.
Well, that's one of the introductions to one of the papers you read from. Even within archaeology, there's a branch or a tradition of just looking at the buildings we can unearth. Just looking at the pottery and what does that mean, and not taking into account, well, what's the meaning of this? What's the context? Well, why was this built? Is that just as important as how? And what's the meaning of this? Because, again, other than for archaeological or historical reasons of a chronology, it adds knowledge to us as humans today. That's what we were talking about earlier, is that they're just people look just like us to some degree. They, of course, it was olden times and they believed different things that we would find repulsive now, but they're still just people. And They did great things that lasted to this day. And why did they attempt that? How were they able to do that? And like I said, it's not necessarily aliens. On the other hand, yeah, if you're a UFO enthusiast, you believe that there's a possibility of aliens. Had they met these folks? I don't know. We weren't there. There's no record of them doing that. Yeah. Now, here's the leap that some people might say. Now, and again, I don't think there's any reason of asking why. When I see ancient aliens in an episode, the whole thing is like, could it have been? Possibly. Could this be? ... Yeah. Fill in the blanks. That's the theme of the show. You can't get mad at them for positing that. Like, you might think it's silly, but like that is the whole aim of the show. Is like the hieroglyphs, where they're speculating what's shown is a giant light bulb of some kind. How do you get light down in there when you're working in the pyramid? Because you can't have torches. You're going to choke everybody out. You're going to burn up the oxygen in there. And they thought, like, well, you use mirrors reflecting sunlight. It's like mirrors won't go that.
Disease light.
Yeah, you can't get light down that far in there.
That's, by the way, just in case anyone's wondering, that's a reference to the Fifth Element.
Yeah, right. And then you have other people saying, well, it's not a light bulb. Obviously, it's like an iris flower, and the bulb around it is representing the smell, the aroma of the beautiful flower. Like, okay, that's one take.
So here we are. We're back at the green light on the dock.
Right.
And The Great Gatsby. It's like the only person who can tell you what that green light meant is F. Scott Fitzgerald.
Yeah.
And for everyone else to sit around and talk about it for hours and hours and write papers and whatever, if you don't have direct knowledge of what he thought it meant, he's the one that wrote it and created it. That's who you need to talk to about it.
Yeah. I mean, in this case, that's the theme of the show. You ask, what if this had alien contact?
Well, and that's what we do, to be fair.
You went to talk to the elders. It's like, well, they have their myths, and there were eagle men. I don't know if that doesn't translate to aliens directly for me, but I don't know.
Right, but you're in that camp where it's like, I believe it's possible that we could be visited by aliens. And if you believe that, then is it vain to think, well, they're only going to come right now while I was alive, or in the last 100 years? They're not going to come back during caveman times, or they're not going to come during Incan times, or they're not going to come during Denisovan times. No, any of that time is a possibility.
Right.
And how would that be recorded in pre-recorded history? Right. Everything is so unknown to you back then anyway, you might not even take it as we would take it today. Because today we have an understanding of how hard it is to get here from anywhere else. Back then, everything that's happening is probably overwhelming.
Yeah.
It's all about just the presentation and everything. So
you're putting words in people's mouths and thoughts in their heads. I think if you're trying to lump people into whole camps broadly, just based on a silly pop culture title. Yeah, the Eagle Men, that could have been Viracocha's Eagle Men, that is likely portrayed on the Gate of the Sun, but who knows what that means? Was it just mythical? Did they actually see some cryptids? A lot of our listeners here like to believe in cryptids. So the last thing I'll say is don't judge something unless those exact words have been said about a particular case. And in this case, what we're going to say next is only based on what we have found out. Well, this is all speculation, but I think you have to start from what do we have to examine, and that's the stones. Those are the remaining pieces of architecture and the artifacts that are left over that are so baffling and so well done that they leave us with questions today. So here are as I see it, and you jump in if this makes sense to you. I ended up liking the idea of some kind of means of fabrication that then did have to use molds, forms, building forms, because for me, I like it because it answers a lot of questions. Because you start to look at, again, just looking at what they had, it's like, that's a bigger unknown, I think, when you say just really good saws and very skilled chisel men working at it for hundreds of years. I do believe, as one researcher, Brian Forrester, who's got quite a few videos on YouTube, and he's written several books. We have those linked on our website. One thing I will agree with him on is that I don't think it was that difficult for them. It's a lot of hard labor.
Oh, yeah. I loved that observation, he said. What they're doing here is so sophisticated that it must have been easier for them than it is to us.
Right.
I mean, that's his implication. He didn't say that verbatim, but it's like, if you can make something this complex, clearly it's not difficult for you to do it.
Right.
Which I thought was a fascinating observation. He was like, this is easy. This is easy for them. That's why these blocks have such sophisticated shapes.
Yeah.
It's not hard for them. Somehow this is easy. Now, the question is the definition of easy, as Cog suggested, generations and generations of slaves working on it, or kids working on it, and then their dads did until their hands fell off, and then their dads did it, and their dads did it, and coming back to a book that we've referenced on the show a few times, which I read and loved, by Ken Follett, called Pillars of the Earth, which centers around a church being built over hundreds of years, and that philosophy may be, and of course that's historical fiction, but it's very well researched on his part. And maybe that is what it is. It is just generations and generations doing something that seems monumental, using the adjective form of that, because that even the most sophisticated person in the world couldn't accomplish it in their lifetime. You look at Gaudi in Barcelona, this church that took 100 years to build, well after he was dead, because of his crazy, sophisticated, almost H.R. Geiger-esque architectural style. And so then when a person comes and looks at that and says, oh, well, I've only got like a few decades here.
Yeah.
There's no way I could do that. Must have taken a miracle. It's not fair to say, oh, no, it took a miracle because no one could do it in one lifetime. But maybe you could do it in several lifetimes or several generations. On the other hand, maybe they found a technology that could get it done in one lifetime. And that technology was the geopolymer technology, combined with, as Cog said, well, if you could do that, why is Professor Davidovits admitting that some of the stones are carved? Why are some of the stones in the pyramids? Oh, that's granite. You can't do it with granite.
Right.
But you can do it with sandstone, and you can do it with this. Could have been a combination of that. Could have been a combination of like, oh, we're doing a geopolymer here. We're pouring this into a form, and then also we do have 100 guys over here walking the moai down the path to get it in, where it needs to go. Maybe it was a combination of those things. We don't know. Why does it have to just be one of them,
Well, exactly. Like I said, it's when people say Occam's razor, it's like, okay, I believe in simple explanations, but what about 5 or 6 or 10 or 20 all working in harmony?
Yeah, exactly.
Again, stop lumping things, because that's what humans do. You want to lump it all in, solve everything, label everything.
One method.
One thing answers all questions. That's how we think, because it's tidy, but that may not be the case. So what I'm going to lay down here on you is one of the possible ways I think these stones may have been shaped. Again, I think there's several technologies perhaps that were indigenous, and there might be an explanation of how they learn this stuff, because we talked about that with cogs too. You just trial and error over hundreds of generations, or do you get a boost, and not from aliens, but from nature? I'm going to explain that in a little bit. So on the one hand, you have again, talking about a parallel to Amelia Earhart. You have, to me, it's always been the crash and sink people. Like, that's the chisel and hammer people.
This is extremely familiar to us because we covered it for years and years. We haven't talked about it lately, but just like a little bit broader for folks that might just be hearing us now. The crash and sink theory is a very specific theory in the camp of all the different theories about what might have happened to Amelia Earhart, that says she just ran out of gas and the plane went into the ocean and it sank and we haven't found it. I just wanted to give it, so when you say crash and sink, I want to make sure everybody understands what that is.
Yeah.
That's the Occam's razor of the Amelia theories.
Right, because obviously she didn't come back. Obviously we don't know where the plane is. That can't be found. So the most likely thing is that she got off course, she ran out of fuel, she crashed in the ocean, she is at the bottom of the ocean with her plane and Fred Noonan. Then there's a bunch of other theories. It's like, okay, well, what if that didn't happen? Could she have crashed but was picked up by the Japanese? That's Japanese capture theory. It's like, well, there are over 200 Chamorros, those are native peoples of Saipan, who claim to have seen a white woman and a white man around that time on the island, which was under Japanese control, pre-World War II, and not very likely. And you're going to discount them because it's like, well, that's not crash and sink. That's a crazy theory where she got picked up and was held until the end of World War II. We're not going there. So what I'm saying, the relationship here is that just smooth cuts somehow with, I don't know, really good saws, with a lot of time and some really precise chiseling done, and just, as Cog said, time and pressure for generations. It's less explainable. To me, that doesn't make as much sense as being able to form these stones in another fashion. So, as we talked about earlier, the geopolymers, some kind of a type of concrete that was poured into forms. But here's another offshoot of that, okay? Now, you and I watched this video. You didn't seem to be as impressed. Not that I was totally impressed with it, but I thought it was interesting, and I thought about it last night. Clues at Ollantaytambo, the lost art of stone softening. I tripped onto this and made a note of it on a Post-it at Christmas time. I knew we were going to cover this probably at some point, didn't know when. Pumapunku was a subject, but I said, well, this is interesting. Well, so we talked a little while ago about the large 6 monoliths at Ollantaytambo, which have the T-sockets and the T-cramps, which are found at Pumapunku. Now, some of the other things that don't make sense is that there are other types of shapes of cramp sockets found in Tiwanaku, like L shapes, T shapes, double Ts.
But it's all the same philosophy.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
You're pouring metal to nail these things together. Now, the host of the channel, I think, is Harvey Turner. Now, I like at the very end, he says, I'm not a scientist. I'm just a guy who finds this really fascinating. And I like that. I like that aspect. It's kind of the Michael Faraday thing, where it's just a guy, he's not formally trained, but he's got some interesting ideas and he runs with them. It's a 5-minute video that maybe sums up how this could have been done by taking clues of what is found at Ollantaytambo. These stones may not be as famous as what are found at Sacsayhuaman or Tambomache. He believes at Ollantaytambo, there is proof that there are softening techniques of granite, rhyolite, andesite, and diorite, and that it was physically possible. This is one site that still has clues that other polygonal megalithic sites do not. It seems that people left during mid-construction. Whatever was going on, it was a little bit of a factory, outdoors, of course, and the construction there by these unknown builders suddenly stopped for some reason. They kind of left it where it was. So you can see the means of production a little bit by the stones and how they're laid out.
Yeah, and that part of this I liked. I liked how he could see there's production areas. It's like it starts over here, it moves here, it moves here. It's like the obelisk that didn't get finished being excavated and the Aswan region, which is, I believe,
oh, you talking about the sand?
Of,
they built the sand ramp?
Yeah, I believe that was one of the remote viewing targets that you had a practice target for with remote viewing, and you got some really amazing information off of that. That was the place that you had to identify. But still, you can see sort of the production line. You can see the Henry Ford in it. It's here.
Possibly.
But, and maybe it's not time to get there yet. There was another part of it that, yes, you're right, it put me off the feet a little bit. So, but I'll wait before I say that.
Yeah, here we go. Just going to briefly go through and explain the process.
Yeah.
The construction there by these unknown builders just suddenly stopped, and that's why you can see possibly the outlay of this factory-like construction site left in mid-production. So he outlines 7 stages of process for stone softening that he's come up with. One is what are called the tired stones, and those are the straight cut stones right from the quarry. These were on the delivery path from the quarry 6 miles to the northwest of the site. And these stones are still, here's another thing though, that they're perfectly cut. Okay, so they're perfectly cut like rectangles, right? All great edges. So they had technology there of some kind to cut these stones from the quarry just like that. The second stage are the inline or ready stones. So what they did is on the other side of the build site, these stones were carried over and being prepared for shaping. Now, these are still straight cuts, and this is where they actually start to mold these into the shapes they need, because all the stones, as you see at these sites, are not just perfect rectangles or squares. Number 3, there are twisted or bent stones. This is kind of weird. You can see in the video, there's 3 in particular that are found at the site that are kind of curved or like a slightly twisted rectangle of soft clay or maybe a jello shot. They're slightly curved and twisted. And it's like, well, maybe perhaps you could, shave it and plane it like that to get that curve for some reason, but it doesn't fit anything else that's seen there.
It looks like a perfect monolith that you picked up in your hands.
Yes.
If you were a giant and you just twisted just a little bit.
Yeah, just a tad.
Yeah, and then put it back down.
Right,
yeah.
It's a smooth bend. Number 4, there are dented stones. There are stones that have these scoops at the edges of some of the other. These are further along in the process. And what it looks like is that there's a spooned out dimple along one of the straight edges on the bottom of the stones. Now, his theory is that the purpose for these is that these were notches to keep the stones in place as they were being lowered into the stone softening solution. Number 5, there's a stone that's found that he's called the cut stone. This is a big stone that looks like it was in mid-production, but what was weird is this rock has a cut line like if you used a wire saw on it. Now, I don't know if you've seen those survival saws with the 2 rings, and it's got the the abrasive cord. And what you do is, if you're in a survival situation, you put a stick through each ring and you can use that as a saw. So it's like a wire saw, as if it had been going through soft clay, because there's a cut line. Now, what I will say is that it's a non-natural looking cut in this rock, not a crack and not a fissure.
Yeah, like a bandsaw is the kind of cut it looks like. Yeah,
very thin though, unlike maybe
Which, by the way, be
find.
Careful, people. Bandsaw will take your finger off. You won't even feel it happen. It'll just be gone.
Yeah. They're that efficient. But unlike that, this thing doesn't look like a few millimeters in thickness. It's very thin. So that's another clue, perhaps. Number 6, there are fitted stones. And these are stone walls where they are complete, but fitted to such tight tolerances. That's where it's amazing. Now, these are the ones, and you've seen pictures of these, where it looks like not so much a jigsaw puzzle.
There's sites with these all over the world, by the way. And I don't think they know how they were built in any case, in any of the places that you see them. But you look at them and everything is so fitted together. It's like, how did these, because they're irregular, but a perfect match.
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
It's literally, they look like a jigsaw puzzle that was thrown into a stone wall.
Unless it's a stylistic that you wanted, like just patchwork looking, why would you then have to cut or chisel these things to, you know what I'm saying? Why don't you just square them off and use as stones? Wouldn't that be easier?
Yeah, why not make them all the same, like a brick, a modern brick? Yeah.
Number 7, again, there's outcroppings of bedrock under the softened fitted stone walls. So again, just this may be a speculation, but you see these walls with perfectly fitted stones, but there's a big chunk of bedrock that's kind of sticking out, like something you can trip over.
I was into all of this analysis, by the way.
Right. So like I said, like you're that proficient at stonework, yet here's this big ledge sticking out of the dirt that people are going to trip over. It's
that you
right
couldn't
in the way
do anything
of everything.
About. Yes.
Yeah. Why couldn't they? Why couldn't that be softened? Okay. So here we go. We have 7 different clues as to how the stonework might have been done. He believes rhyolite stones were saw cut in the quarry, then hauled down the mountain and then up the other side of the mountain to the site. Then the stones were transferred from the carrying sleds into these processing trays. These rounded positioning slots or notches were then carved into the bottom edges of the stones so they wouldn't shift in these large trays. These things were then lowered into a soaking tank where the quartz-rich igneous stones were soaked in a plant-based softening solution along with a low-intensity sonic vibration that over time softens the rhyolite stone into the consistency, the video says, between clay and whale blubber. That's just his thinking. I'm not sure how that was described, and I don't know what he means by sonic vibration, but I will get to that, my own theory on that in a little bit here. Then the next process is the stone is placed onto a cutting table. Now the stone is starting to harden, so they have to hurry. So then wire saws and sonic saws would then be used to slice up the soft stone into the needed
sonic saw.
I'm going to propose a
which he doesn't explain at all, by the way.
Well,
he just says sonic saws.
No, here's the thing. In his defense, you have to watch the other videos.
I looked at his channel. There is nothing on his channel about sonic saws.
Did you watch all the videos?
No, but I mean, it should be in the title. If you're just going to say, oh, and we're going to use a floozy blodget. All right, what is a floozy blodget? There's got to be a video about the floozy blodget.
Well, yes, but at the same time, if you've done a bunch of videos, you don't want to have to keep re-explaining everything like we do.
Yeah, but if you're talking about something that no one knows exists, I'm just saying.
To be fair to this guy is that we'd have to watch all his videos. And then if he never explains it, okay. If he does explain it somewhere else, then we just haven't seen it yet. So, but I'm going to give you my wild off-the-wall theory on what that might be. So here's the next step. The stone is, shaped and sliced up into, while it's still soft, into the shapes that you need, into the rough shapes, because you can draw a pattern and you know what kind of shapes generally you need. So then you take that stone and you place it into its desired location. And again, I know what this is, but it's a sonic clamp. And it might be something like Edley Scalnan and how he was able, what he claimed was the method he was able to lift these giant stones by himself, a 5 foot tall guy.
Yeah, but this guy's just putting words out there and not backing up how they might work at all.
Hold on. It's unfair to judge this whole theory by a 5-minute offshoot video.
No. But here's the thing. I think all his observations are spot on. It's fascinating. I'm into it. Why is the bedrock there? I'm into all of that.
Right.
But when he switches gears to how it was done, he completely loses me almost from the jump. With sonic clamps and sonic saws and Sonic the Hedgehog? Who's working on it?
If you heard 5 minutes of one of our 4-hour-long marathon idiotic shows and said this is a bunch of baloney, would that be fair? You know what I'm saying? It's like we're judging all this on 5 minutes of just like a cut down video where he's explaining one thing. maybe he has a book. I don't know. You'd have to get, you know what I'm saying, to judge what that thing is.
I know. I'm just saying, I looked around for that stuff and didn't see it. I looked through all his videos, his entire catalog. It wasn't huge. But it was like none of them seemed to explain what he thought these magical sonic things were.
We've watched one that is only 5 minutes long.
Yeah.
Now just hang with me, okay? So I don't know.
Okay.
Please let me continue. So
Please.
with the sonic soft stick, the sonic clamp as methods, because maybe this solves another problem, something you had a problem with. What he says is then the stones are pressed while they're still semi-soft, pressed into place, while that makes them very soft, smooth, fit exactly, perfectly, no tolerances, no gaps, into the space that they needed. And in this softened state, they then use these sonic tools to get the stone to settle and fit, and then left to be hardened. And eventually it hardens back to its natural state over time. Now what he proposes is that this bedrock could not be softened because it couldn't be fit into a tank. This is a process that needs to be soaked with vibration. Okay, talking about sonic clamps, here's my crazy theory. If these folks had sophisticated knowledge, even just very artisan knowledge about metallurgy, could they create something like a tuning fork that's a rod that produces a vibration? Could this vibration then, see now I sound like Giorgio. Could this vibration have aided in the soaking? Because that's what you were saying. Like, well, okay, you soak this rock in this herbal bath bomb. How does the juice get inside to the middle of the rock to soften that part too? Well, maybe you didn't need to soften all of it because you're only shaping the outsides of it. Maybe it only had to be softened down 3 or 4 inches so you could shape the general form that's already been quarried. Or maybe the vibration that you're applying in these tubs somehow gets the juice, the mojo to the inside of the rock to make the whole thing kind of softened so you can twist it. Who knows?
I'm with all of that. I just don't think this guy's presenting it the right way. That's just me. This channel, by the way, for folks who are looking for it on YouTube, it's called Intriguing Megalithic Perspectives.
Intriguing Megalithic Perspectives. But what I'm saying is, hold your judgment till you've watched a few, not just one 5-minute video explaining a very complicated process. Actually, it's not that complicated. There's a bath in there. So
I'm just telling you, there's 28 videos up there. One of them's about how to adjust your headlight on a Volkswagen Jetta. So
you might want to know that too. Maybe he talks about sonic rods and vibration with that. You don't know. That's what I'm saying.
I don't
judge a video by its title.
No, but I'm just telling him, looking at all the titles and looking at all the covers, there's nothing here suggesting how the sonic stuff he's mentioning in the Ollantay Tambo video works.
Okay. He's fired up.
I'm just not on board with presenting. I do like the analysis this guy makes, but when he turns corners as to how he thinks it was done, I'm almost immediately was completely off the train with him.
All of this is speculation. Geopolymers are speculation.
Geopolymers are speculation written about and scientifically studied in peer-reviewed journals and published. That's different from what's happening here, though.
Yes, but my final point, don't make me jump to the end already. Just let me say my point here.
Okay.
Here's the thing. If you're wondering how the Tiwanaku may have found out about this, rather than just spending generations of trial and error, as we talked about before, one comment from Sean Conway about a year ago suggests, listen to this, there are plants that grow in the area that produce an acid that can be used to soften rocks. Explorers noticed that their boots, spurs, and weapons blunted very quickly when traversing the nearby jungles. When they asked the locals, they explained that certain plants produced an acid. They showed the explorers birds that nested in cliff faces that used the leaves to carve out their nests using their beaks into the cliff face. So it's a natural answer. They observed the birds. The birds like, how are they able to make holes in the cliff face? Well, they seem to be gathering this type of plant.
That's awesome.
And using that to maybe soften the rocks and then pecking at it. Well, but what I was going to say is that vibration, perhaps, I know it's not explained in this video.
No. And we talked about it in the Coral Castle, and I'm on board with the idea
So here's something else I sprung on you before, though, is that there's a lot of interesting properties with sound. I believe Ed Leeds-Scallan knew something about sound and electromagnetism.
Yeah, there were tuning forks, I think, at the Coral Castle.
So that's what I'm saying. There were tuning forks. They found a dynamo that had magnets on it. Well, what else is magnetized up there? Guess what? Tiwanaku. Some stones were magnetized.
That's right. That's a good point.
Here's the other thing that Giorgio points out. When you stick them into one of those blind holes, perfectly carved into the stones, they're magnetized in different directions.
Right.
What's going on there? What is that just part of is it a byproduct, an accident? Did they magnetize these stones for a reason? And why do they point then and why are they magnetized in different directions depending on what hole you put your compass into?
Yeah.
Is it magnetism? Is it vibrations? Because we talked about this earlier, and this comes from Science Friday, which you love. Remember?
Yes,
Ira
the first
Flato?
podcast I ever listened to, Science Friday.
Right. I started thinking about what does vibration do? It has a shape to it. Could the properties of vibration and sound be used to shape anything, like with the properties of what are called cymatics? Now, from the sciencefriday.com website, in an article entitled Seeing the Patterns in Sound, a pair of artists find ghostly imagery in sound vibrations by writer Chan Tu on November 7, 2016. Starts off with an explanation of just what it is. That's all I'm going to read here. In the late 18th century, German physicist and musician Ernst Chladni demonstrated how vibrations could be used to create striking imagery by spreading fine sand across the top of a metal plate and running a violin bow alongside, creating the vibration. Chladni showed that the sand would settle into distinct patterns depending on the frequencies of the sound waves produced by the bow. Centuries later, in the 1960s, a Swiss physician named Hans Jenny built on Chladni's experiments in an effort to study vibrational phenomena, what he called cymatics. So there you go. Since the Tiwanaku had skills with sophisticated metallurgy, could they have developed metal rods or saws or lifting claws or softening tubs that acted like tuning forks, delivering harmonic vibrations that aided in the stonework manipulation?
How did they create? But this is my question, and this is the other question I have, going back to the YouTube channel and also the idea of the softening tub, which was another thing that I jumped off the train on. But because I'm on board with the geopolymer idea and the acidic components of the agriculture that they were raising so effectively to create these geopolymers, which they could cast and then harden and all of that kind of stuff. And I'm also even the idea that's suggested by the YouTube channel that we were just having a spirited debate about. I'm open to the idea of using acidic plants or these plant compounds to soften the outside of the stone. It's the inside part that and it's funny. Why am I drawing my line in the sand here? Like, oh, well, yeah, sure. You can soften the outside of a rock, but the inside, give me a break. Because my thing is like, why is the outside working? And then the inside, okay, that's a sonic thing. What is how are you applying anything sonic to a stone like that? I don't know. Which I think Leeds Scotland might have done in the Coral Castle, which is another thing we've covered before. But
let's set aside the sonic thing. If you can have some kind of an acid bath that will soften, let's say, just 2 or 3 inches inside the stone, like that's, the stone is porous, especially, well,
depending on the stone. Limestone is super porous, so right.
It can sink in, certainly, a certain degree, and that's all you need to get a shape out of it that you want. Because you're not, like I said, you're not starting off with a giant medicine ball shaped round thing and trying to make it square. That's inefficient.
Get the big balls in Costa Rica.
Right. More efficiently is you start off with a cut that's more like the shape you want to end up with. Why spend all that time and effort whittling this big old ball down into something, so you start off the standing stones, the lazy stones, the very first ones quarried are in the general shape. And then they just need to get them a little bit fashioned into something that will fit into the hole they're trying to patch.
Right.
So let's set that aside though. So really though, you just have a chemical process. Now we're back to geopolymers, which I think, again, for me, it's not that out there.
And it's not out there for Cogs, which it carries way more weight than how we feel about
Exactly. Exactly. Like I said.
Got a doctorate in chemical engineering. He's like, you know what? This is plausible. There's parts of this that are plausible. Although he still didn't think it was the most likely explanation.
Well, because it has more moving parts. There's more chemistry. The other one is like, well, okay, so the chisel and hammer approach, the crash and sink, that just chisel this out for centuries, that's not as complicated, but it just seems like a lot of work to get something. And also, there are artisan techniques being used that are still baffling. If you're just going to use a brass chisel and a rock hammer, it doesn't make that much sense to me. So to wrap up my long rambling, whatever you want to call this, I like this theory of geopolymers and stone softening because it seems to answer a lot more questions, for me anyway, about the unbelievable precision and artistry found at Tiwanaku and elsewhere. But until we unearth more evidence about their technology, I think we have to take the stance of archaeology. That's where I'm going to land on this. And people might be blown away by that. No, I love archaeology, and I think that's the most logical. I think we have to take the stance of archaeology and just admit we don't know how they accomplished their amazing feats. And that is the mystery of Pumapunku.
That's going to wrap up our series, The Mystery of Pumapunku. A very special thanks to our good friend, Dr. Chris Cogswell, for joining us tonight. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a new show. Meanwhile, visit patreon.com/astonishinglegends to access our exclusive bi-weekly junk drawer show that runs every week. The main show is dark.
Please remember to support our sponsors. They help keep the show free and the lights on in Blanket Fort Tiana.
Special thanks to John Bolin.
Hi, I'm Josh Harrod.
I'm Natasha Levis.
Hi, I'm Sarah.
I'm Natasha Levis.
Galaxy-wide in perpetuity.
Sarah. Sarah.
Our show is edited by Sarah Voorhees Wendell and co-produced by Tess Feifel, who is also our head of research.
Our theme, which is available as a ringtone, was composed by Judson Crane, and our sound design and additional composing is by Ryan McCullough.
Special thanks to the Astonishing Research Corps.
But most importantly, we want to thank you, our listeners. Visit our store at astonishinglegends.com or interact with us and other listeners on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram.
You can also support the show at patreon.com/astonishinglegends, where patrons have access to additional bonus content. No part of this show may be reproduced anywhere without permission. Copyright Astonishing Legends Productions.
Good night.